Well, good morning. We're glad you're here this morning. And before I introduce our special guest this morning, I do want to ask that all of you remember our missions team. They left Saturday morning at 4:30 a.m. I was here with them as we sent them off. And we, in that team, went 4 dentists, 2 doctors, almost $40,000 worth of medical supplies and medicine went down to our orphanage in the Dominican Republic. So pray for the 33 families that are represented there on that journey, and that not only that the God uses them in great ways, that they have safe travel, that they remain well in this, in a foreign context, but just pray for them as they are on that journey, that they arrive back here next Sunday night well and fit and all of those sort of good things. Well, this morning we have a wonderful special guest, Marie Monville. Many of you are familiar with her story, but one of the powerful things about her story is that she has allowed God to work in her life and allowed God to use it to help us wherever it is that we are. And she does that very well. Let's pray together, and then we'll welcome Marie. Jesus, we do thank you for your grace, your mercy, your presence in this place. Lord, we pray for our missions team that's away this week, working hard for your name and for your glory in the Dominican. And then, Jesus, right now, we just pray that our hearts and minds would be open as Marie comes to share with us. We love you, Jesus, and we praise you. In your name, amen. Let's welcome Marie.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a privilege to be here with you and share a little bit of my journey and my walk with the Lord. And as I was asking God what was on his heart for you today, excuse me, I felt like he was saying, I want to remind you that I'm writing a beautiful story over your lives. In my life, in my journey, there have been those moments where it hasn't always felt beautiful. Life doesn't always feel beautiful. It doesn't always look beautiful, but it is because God is always working in our lives. In the past couple months, I've just been studying the book of Joshua, and sometimes I find myself within those pages. Joshua seemed to face one battle after another. It was like one thing came against him, one battle that he had to fight, and then there was another one. And it was this constant progression of just one thing after another. And I know for myself, and probably for a lot of you, you feel like sometimes your life is just this one thing after another, this one battle that you're facing, another battle that you're facing. But the beautiful thing about the book of Joshua is that God didn't just send him out to fight all these battles. He gave him a promise. Right at the very start of this book, we see the Lord give him a promise, and he says, every place that you put your foot, I've given to you. No one will be able to stand against you. Be strong and courageous. He says that thing, be strong and courageous, many times throughout this book. He's encouraging Joshua to believe for the promises that God has given him. And I know for myself, God has made promises over my life. I'm going to tell you about that this morning, and some of the promises that, didn't quite work out the way I thought they would. But God is always faithful. He's always with us. He's always walking this out with us. And just like in Joshua, we'll see God do those very same things in our lives, in that place of battle, in that place of celebration. And that's what I want to share with you this morning. When I was a little girl growing up in Lancaster County, I just wanted to be a wife and a mom. That was pretty much it. I didn't have any, big goals or aspirations for my life aside from that. And I was a very shy girl. In fact, if you would have said, Marie, at some point in your life you're going to be standing up on stages and talking to people, I probably would have run as fast as I could in the other direction. But God has shown me things about who I am that I missed all those other years. And mostly that's happened because of the difficult things I've gone through. And I think it's the beauty of God that even in those hard places, we see beautiful things about who God is and who he has created us to be. And I'm sure that you find that in your life. You don't want to go through those hard moments, but you wouldn't give away what you found in those places. When we find ourselves in the wilderness, we're walking with the Lord. He doesn't abandon us. He doesn't forsake us. He doesn't leave us there, but he walks with us. And that's what I found in my life. I met Charlie when I was in high school. We got married right out of me graduating from high school. And I kind of thought, wow, life is exactly what I wanted. I just wanted to be a wife and a mom. Here I am, a wife. What could be better? We found out in that first year of marriage that we were expecting a baby. And so I thought, this is great. Life is going to look exactly like I want it to. What could be better than that? It's this blank canvas. I can paint it any way I choose. But life doesn't always go the way we want. And our circumstances don't always turn out to be what we'd hoped they would. And we lost our first daughter at 26 weeks of pregnancy. She was born and lived only 20 minutes. And the doctor said, there's nothing really wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with her. We just don't understand why this has happened. And I said to the Lord, okay, God, how can this be me, and how can I be going through this? All my life I've just said, I just want to be a wife and a mom, and here I am, laying in the hospital. My child has died, and I'm listening to the sounds of newborns crying down the hallway. How can this be me? And where are you in this? I had asked Jesus in my heart when I was 5. I had grown up going to church. I read the word, I prayed, but suddenly I realized I didn't trust God. I didn't trust him unless he was going to give me this stamp, this guarantee, everything will go the way you want it. And I knew that that's not trust. And so I said, okay, God, how can I be in this place where I've walked with you my whole life? I've read these stories in the word that aren't just stories. They're alive, you're alive, and you're doing these things, but how can I be at this place where I've walked with you all this time and it's like it doesn't matter because I know that I don't trust you? And you must be so disappointed in me. And I felt him saying to me, you know what, Marie? I'm not disappointed in you because I knew all along you didn't trust me. This isn't a surprise to me. This might be a surprise to you, but it's not a surprise to me. But I felt him saying, you know what? Here's the thing. Now that you know it, we can do something about it. I can help you through this. And I said, okay, God, I don't really know what it looks like to trust you, but would you help me to open my heart, to let go of these things that I've held on to so tightly, just to give you control and to trust that you have good things in store for my life, whether they ever look like what I thought they were supposed to or not. And I think our growth with God oftentimes is much like watching our kids grow. So my youngest, Carson, he's 10, and he had this thing last year where he thought every night when he went to bed in the morning he woke up, he was taller. He was like, Mom, I felt it. I was growing while I slept last night. Measure me. See how tall I am. We have this wall in the kitchen where we kind of mark off the kid's height. All right, Carson, I'll check, but I hate to tell you, I think you're probably the same size you were yesterday. And he was. And so we did this for like a couple weeks until, he kind of got over it. And then for a couple months, we forgot to check. And all of a sudden, one day, I was like, wow, Carson, all of your clothes are too small. I think you must be growing. Like, go stand on that wall. And he had grown a couple inches. I think our growth with God is like that. We're looking for these constant things like, am I better than I was yesterday? And sometimes that's impossible to tell. Because, base it on our emotions, we can feel 100 different ways any moment. But in that space of time when we look back, we can see that God was working, that he was doing things. And that's kind of what I found in my walk of faith and learning how to trust the Lord. It didn't happen overnight. I was constantly saying, am I better than I was yesterday? And feeling frustrated because it didn't look any different to me. But in that space of time, God really started to open my heart to help me let go of my circumstances and just say, okay, God, I don't know what all this is supposed to look like, but I trust you. You are a God who loves me. The whole point to all of this is that you love me. The reason that you sent Christ to earth, the reason that he chose to die on the cross is because you love us. So help me to walk out life in your love. I don't want to just get through the motions. I don't want to just do this day to get it done with. I want to find you in it, and I want to have joy in this. Even though it's not what I wanted, it's not what I thought my life was going to be like, God, I want to have joy. Help me to find that. Help me to find you. And he did. And one day, that summer after the loss, I had been just worshiping the Lord, and the melody and the chorus that I would sing most often, this worship CD that was out, it said, I delight in you, you make my heart jump. And there was one particular afternoon as I'm worshiping, that I just feel the Lord say to me, Marie, I want you to look up the name Abigail in your baby name book. And I knew that I wasn't pregnant, but I said, okay, God, I'll check it out. In the book that I had, it also gave a scriptural reference to each name. And so with Abigail, it said Psalm 37:4, delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. And I felt like this whole thing that I had been singing all summer, it just came alive inside of me in a new way, that God was promising me, Marie, I'm going to give you a daughter named Abigail. I didn't know what this was going to look like. I had a feeling it wasn't going to be immediate. We actually had a second loss of pregnancy after God gave me that promise. And I remember, coming face to face with that and saying, okay, the circumstances of my life don't look like what God's promised me, but I know he always fulfills his promises. He does, and I can trust him. I can trust that if he's said this to me, I don't know what that's going to look like, and I'm not sure how long it's going to take to work out, but God, I know that you won't let me down. He won't. He won't let us down. You know, it says that he does exceedingly and abundantly more than we could ask or think or imagine, and he's done that in my life. A couple months after that, after that second loss, I found out that I was pregnant, and there was just something different this time. I knew this was going to be Abigail. And so people would say to me, "Are you having a boy or a girl?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm having a girl because God told me so. It's going to be a girl. Her name's going to be Abigail." And it was. She is. She's 16 now. She's as tall as I am. And I can look at her and say, this is what it looks like when God makes a promise. It's beautiful. He doesn't forget that. He doesn't forget when he's made a promise to us. He won't let us down. And he walks with us. Every step of the way, he walks with us. In 2006 came, Abigail was 7. Bryce had been born a couple years after her. He was 5. Carson was born a couple years after that. He was a year and a half. And to look at my life, it seemed like I was living my dream. I was a stay-at-home mom. I was a wife. I had these 3 great kids, a husband. But every day wasn't perfect. But nothing alluded to what was coming. We spent the weekend with Charlie's family and my family. There wasn't anything that any of us could look back upon and say, hey, we could see it now. There were no signs of what was to come. That Monday morning, October 2nd, was beautiful. It was one of those Indian summer kind of days when the windows are open and the breeze is coming in and it's warm and beautiful. There was nothing that would have pointed its way to say, this is going to be a day that your life changes. Charlie walked down to the bus stop with us that morning. Abigail was in 2nd grade. Bryce was in kindergarten. The kids got on the bus, and he said, "I love you," and there was no way to know that would be the last time they saw him. He had some things that he said he needed to do for work, and so he left, and a couple hours later he called and he said, "Marie, I'm not coming home." And I had never heard his voice sound like that before. It was cold and lifeless. And I knew that he was serious, that I would never see him again. But I didn't know why. He wasn't giving specifics. And so I just kept saying to him, don't do whatever you're planning to do. I was worried that he would harm himself, but had no idea it would involve anyone else, much less children. I said, don't do whatever you're planning to do. Don't do it. There's got to be another way. There's always another way. But he wasn't listening to me, and so before he hung up the phone, he said, tell my family that I love them, tell the kids I love them, and I left a note for you on the dresser. So I went to find the note, and as I read it, I thought, I've never read a suicide note before, but I think that this must be one. And so I called 911 thinking, well, maybe something I know can help to stop whatever's going on. I could hear the sounds of the sirens from our local fire department and the helicopters and the police cars, and I knew that this must all be related. And as I talked to the dispatcher and told them what had happened, I could tell that they knew more than I did. But they wouldn't tell me what was going on. And it wasn't long after our conversation ended that the police were in my driveway and they were coming to the door, and I went to meet them and I said, "It's Charlie, isn't it?" And they said, "Yes." And I said, "And he's dead, isn't he?" And they said, "Yes." And they came inside and told me things and asked me questions that no one would want to hear. We didn't watch the news. I didn't want my kids exposed to what life truly can look like. And suddenly our lives looked worse than what you see most days on the headlines. And I said, God, what are we going to do? God, help. That was the prayer I prayed most that day. God, help. I didn't know what to say except that. Not just help for me, but help for the Amish families, help for the first responders, everybody that was affected by this. God, would you help? And as I stood in my living room that day, the police had left, and I was collecting some things. One detective had stayed with me. I knew that I had to get out of my house before the media got there, but I just stood there and had this moment of a great encounter with the Lord. And I said, okay, God, I know that I have to make a choice about what I'm going to believe my life to be, and there are only two choices. I can choose to believe that this life is over and I am going down like the fastest sinking ship. Or I can choose to believe that you are everything you say you are, that you are everything that's written in the pages of the Word. You are everything you've ever spoken to my heart, everything I've ever heard someone testify of you to be. God, I can choose to believe that you are all of that. and that somehow you will come to rescue us. You know, I knew that I was desperate. I had nothing, but I knew that I had nothing to lose by trusting the Lord. I had nothing to lose by trusting him. And I simply said, okay, God, whatever you can do with this, do it. I trust you. Not just for my family, but for everybody, God, whatever you can do, do it. I don't think God needed my permission. I don't think he needed me to make that choice to allow him to do what he wanted to do in my life. I think he would have done it anyway. But I needed that. I needed to make that choice so that I would choose to look for him. I needed him to change my perspective and to open my eyes that he would come to rescue me. That it wasn't about me, but it was all about him. You know, what God's done in my life, he hasn't done for me because he thought I was special or because he pitied me out of these circumstances. He did it because he loves me and because his plan has always been redemption. I went to my parents' house that day. They had gotten my kids from school. They were outside playing in the backyard. I could hear the sounds of their laughter coming in through the windows. I said, God, you've got to fix this. You have to fix this because this was not supposed to be their lives. They were not supposed to know pain like this, and you have to fix it. And I felt him say to me, you know what, Marie, I'm not going to fix it, but I am going to redeem it. You know, there's parts of our lives that just aren't fixable. There's not a quick answer. There's no easy way out. But it's not beyond God. There's no thing that we have ever chosen for ourselves, and nothing that anyone has ever done to us that's beyond him. He is a God of redemption, and he will make a way. I called my kids in, Abigail on one side, Bryce on the other, and Carson on my lap, and I simply said, today your dad made some very bad choices. Some people got hurt, and some people died, and he died too. I knew that they needed to know the entire story. I knew that they needed to know that I would tell them the truth, even if it was hard, but they didn't need to know it all at once. But you know, God met us in that place. He met us right where we were, and I felt his peace. He took away my fear, and he gave me peace. He gave me courage, and he gave me strength that I would have never thought possible. And I can look back on that day, and I can say, you know, that is one of the hardest days of my life. It was very hard. And I can see these moments that broke my heart. I can see that moment where I was sitting on the couch with my kids. But God, I can also see you right there. And I can see the things that you did that day that were so you. The way that you reminded my heart that I had a choice to make, that I could choose to trust you. You know, when the enemy thought that he was victorious that day, he wasn't. That I could choose to believe that we would be victorious because of who God is. I can look back on that day and I can see both things, and I can see the beauty of who God is in a greater way than the tragedy that we went through. God is a God of redemption. That afternoon, I was standing in my parents' kitchen and I was looking out the window. I saw some Amish men walking down the street. I knew that they were coming to my parents' home. You know, this is the town that I had grown up in. We knew each other. I didn't know what to say to them. There was nothing that I could say that could matter in light of all that they had faced that day. And I went to my parents and I said, what do I say? And my dad said, it's okay, Marie, you can stay inside and I'll go out and talk with them. So I watched him from the window. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see everything. I saw the way that they put their hands on his shoulders. I saw the tears that flowed down everyone's faces and the way they embraced before the men walked off. And as he came inside, we waited for him to collect himself from the emotion of that moment. And he said, Marie, they came because they were concerned about you. They were concerned about the kids. They wanted to make sure that you were okay. They wanted you to know that they had forgiven Charlie and that they were extending grace and compassion over your family. And I was stunned because of all the things that I thought, you know, all the things that were racing through my mind as I saw them walking down that street, all the questions they could have asked me or the demands they could have made, they didn't come for any of that. But instead they came to give a gift, to tell of the forgiveness that they had already extended over Charlie and of their concern and of their compassion for us. And God did something powerful in my heart that day by their very act, because everyone was looking to me to give them answers. I didn't have any answers. I had unanswered questions. And I felt the weight of all of that. But in that moment when they came and they poured out, their forgiveness of Charlie and their grace and compassion over us, God used that to take away the weight I felt. They didn't choose to forgive Charlie because it was going to matter to him. They didn't do it for him. When we choose to forgive someone, when I chose to forgive Charlie, God does something in our hearts because of that, but it also becomes this thing that we can extend to others. It became such a gift to me, such a gift to my family. And that's why I can look on that day and I can say, God, you were so there. You were right in the midst of all of it. All of this came as a surprise to me, God, but you knew and you were there. And I think when I look back across my life, it's, kind of like seeing this trail of Hansel and Gretel crumbs that lead me right back to the Lord. I could see him. I knew that he was with me, and if he was with me in those moments, he was going to be with me all the rest of the way. I could trust him. It didn't make it easy. It didn't change my circumstances, but he gave me grace and he gave me strength to get through it. I knew that I wasn't alone, that he was with me. And that week was one of the hardest weeks of my life. So many difficult conversations with my kids, with the police, with other people. So many times just wondering, how were the Amish families doing and what was going on in my community. And God, why is this my life? And I'm supposed to wake up every day and do this over and over again? How am I supposed to lead my kids through this? How am I supposed to find healing for my heart in the midst of this? God, you knew I wanted to be a wife and a mom, and these are the two places where I've known the most pain. Why? Those were some of the questions that went through my head that week and in the weeks that followed. I needed to know that he saw my heart. I needed to know that he saw the pain that I felt, and I knew he did. And he also showed me that he feels our pain too. He felt it. He saw it. And he carried it for me if I was willing to give it to him. There's so many places across my journey that I can see the way that God intersected my life. And I can't imagine what life would look like if he hadn't done that. Because he's there. In the moment of our greatest pain, he's there. And we don't have to know the answers. We don't have to know the way out. We just have to know him. And we just have to choose. All right, God, I can't see my way through this, but I know you can and I can trust you. And maybe you're here today and you feel a little bit like I did, or a little bit like Joshua, that every day is another struggle, another problem, another battle that you're going through. But God makes us a promise. He will not leave us. He will not forsake us. He is with us every day. He is working things out for our good. What the enemy meant for evil, he will use for good. He does exceedingly and abundantly more than we could ask, think, or imagine. All of those things are true about him. And they're true in my life, and they're true in yours. And so while as a little girl I never would have dreamt that I would be on a stage, much less want to be on one, I can't imagine it any different now, because I know that if God has done all of this for me, he wants to do something big for you too. The more times I share my story and the more stories that are shared with me, I know that while the circumstances of our lives might be different, we often feel a lot of the same things. And if God is capable of working out this amazing plan of redemption for me, what does he want to do in your life? He is writing a beautiful story over you. And even if you can't see him and you don't think it looks beautiful, it doesn't mean that he's not working. It doesn't mean that he's not working. He's faithful. In the months that followed, I continued to have that conversation with the Lord. God, why? I always wanted to be a wife and a mom, and these are the two places I know the greatest pain. And I said, okay, God, you know what? If there's some man on the face of this earth that can handle what my life looks like now, that's great. Bring me one guy, because I'm not dating. But if there isn't, I totally get that. Jesus, if it's just you and me from now till forever, I'm okay with that. But God is good, and he answers the desires of our heart, just like he says in Psalm 37:4. I wouldn't have anticipated that he would have done it quickly. And it's just this really amazing journey of how he did that, and some of it's quite funny. And I don't have time to share that all with you this morning, so if you're interested in that aspect in particular, you'll have to catch it in the book. But God had started to speak to me about this man, Dan Monville. Dan was actually married to my dad's first cousin. I went to his wedding when I was 13, didn't really see him afterwards, heard the stories when he and his wife had kids and when they got divorced, but our families didn't get together. People that he knew that he had some kind of distant connection to me. His ex-mother and father-in-law were my great-aunt and uncle. And so they had given him some things for my kids and said, hey, could you get these to Marie? He said to his ex-mother-in-law, hey, can you give these to Marie? You go past her house a couple times a week to choir practice. And she said, no, why don't you just do it? So she gave him my contact information. And we had connected. He came to my parents' house to drop the things off one day. But in the time after that, God really started to speak to my heart about Dan. And I said, God, you've got to have this all wrong, because you cannot be telling me that I'm going to get married now, like it's only been a couple months. And so I spent 3 days arguing with the Lord, saying, God, one of us has a problem. Either I can't hear you or you're not speaking clearly, because this can't possibly be what you're saying. And at the end of the 3 days, I felt like he said to me, Marie, do you remember when you asked me to do big things for you? Why can't you just take what I'm giving? And I said, okay, God, I won't argue with you anymore, but I'm not going to make this happen. I'm not going to do one thing about this. You're just going to have to figure it out on your own. Well, after Christmas that year, Dan emailed me and said, hey, Marie, I have some friends that go to your church. I'd always thought about visiting there. Do you mind if I come? I said, why would I care? A church is a free building. Anybody can go there that wants to. And amazingly enough, he still came the following week. He sat in the same row with me. Our kids kind of chattered a little bit. And after church, he said, can I give you a call? I want to tell you what God's been speaking to my heart. And I thought, okay, I love talking to people about what God's doing, but I know what God was telling me about you. What was God telling you about me? So he called and he said, for the past 6 weeks, I really felt the Lord telling me that I was going to marry you, and I have spent 6 weeks arguing with the Lord. Well, I thought, hey, that makes my 3 days look a little better. So he was telling me all of these things about his life and kind of, how he had been on this track with the Lord and what God had been saying and, how he was at the place he was today. And we really felt like the Lord was calling us to date very intentionally, knowing that he was doing more than just, a dating relationship in our lives and not wanting to expose our kids to any more heartache. But it was easy to see, even from those first couple dates, how well our family blended together. We did these group dates. I had 3 kids, he had 2, and so there were 7 of us wherever we went. And, it wasn't after too many dates that Bryce, who was 5, said to me, hey, Mom, could you ask Dan to marry you? And I said, no, Bryce, girls don't ask boys to marry them. And he said, okay, just ask him to ask you to marry him. Because the world is very black and white to a 5-year-old boy. But I started to say, okay, God, you know that every kid needs a mom and a dad, and my kids need a dad more now than ever before, and I trust you. And he did this amazing, remarkable thing. I never would have thought that I would marry Dan 8 months after losing Charlie, but that's what God did. And I can't imagine life any other way, because he's a fabulous dad for our kids, and he's an amazing support to me. And people would always say to us, are you going to have any more children? And I'd say, no, I don't think so, but I knew that the Lord was going to call us to adopt. And I think the first time I mentioned it to Dan, we were potty training Carson and doing driver training with Nicole. I think you have a picture of our family you can pop up on the screen. So they range in age now. This is our son we adopted, and I'll tell you about him in a minute. But we were driver training with Nicole, and Carson there, he was potty training, and everybody else was kind of in between. And Dan said, Marie, have you forgotten we have 5 kids? Why would we adopt? How could we do more than we're doing right now? And I said, but that's the thing about God's grace. He always gives you more than enough. You can't imagine it till you're in that moment, but he does. And so a couple years later, I would continue this conversation off and on with him. And a couple years later, he said, Maria, I think that the Lord is calling us to adopt. But it was so not the right time. I tend to think, okay, whenever things line up, they're all going to work out. But right after Dan said that, my dad got cancer, and he lived for only 8 months before he passed away. And then my mom sold her house, and she moved in with us for a couple months, and I knew we couldn't do the adoption then, and so we just continued to pray about it. And in July of 2014, I said, okay, Dan, the Lord is really putting this on my heart. I think it's now. And he was praying about it too, and he said, I think you're right. And so we started to pursue an adoption internationally. We got matched with South Africa. We really wanted to adopt internationally because there are so many kids waiting, and oftentimes they're just sent out into the streets at 15. I was looking at my own kids thinking, they can't even get their dishes in the dishwasher. How do you live like that? It was an amazing process. It was 1 year start to finish. And last July, we found ourselves in South Africa to adopt this little boy that God placed on our heart. During the process, we saw him and just knew immediately that that was the one that's our son. And it has been this remarkable journey, this amazing adventure. And you can put that other picture up if you'd like. So he always has a smile on his face, except for that first time we were taking our family pictures, but and he actually turns 10 this week. And you know, he is just this amazing blessing from the Lord. And so many people say to me, oh, he's so blessed to have you. And I say, you know what? It's the other way around. We're so blessed that God chose us to have him. And I think about that, you know, what if we hadn't chosen to go out on a limb with you, God? What if we had said no when you called us to adopt? We would be missing this amazing blessing that you've given us, because it's totally changed our life. I feel like he brings out the best in everybody. But God is faithful. You know, our son, the caseworker, told us that whenever they would go into the orphanage, he would say to them, have you found my family yet? He had been waiting for a family his whole life. And she would say, no, I'm sorry, I haven't. And the chances of being adopted after you turn 5 are very, very small. And she knew that as the time went on, his chance of being adopted became smaller and smaller. And then one day, she was handing him the photo book that we sent with our pictures in it, and he said, I always wanted a big white family. And I thought, God, if I ever needed the reminder that you hear our prayers and answer them, it's that. You took the prayers of this little boy on the bottom of the continent of Africa, 7,000 miles away. You took our prayers that we prayed in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and somehow in your hands, they came together. And you've allowed us to become the answer to his prayer. And he's become the answer to ours. You know, God is faithful, and I love what Joshua says towards the end of the book. He says, not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. Not one of the promises that God has made to me, not one of the promises that he has made to you will ever fail. Even if your life doesn't look like the circumstances of what you think the answer to a promise is, he's working it out. He is a God of redemption, and he always keeps his promises. You can trust him. Because if he has done all of this in my life, what does he have planned for you? God, I thank you that you are a good God. I thank you that you give good gifts to your children, God, that it's not based on what our circumstances look like. It's based on the fact that you love us. You love us with everlasting loving kindness. It knows no beginning and it knows no end. And so, God, today I ask that we would open our hearts to you, that we would open them wide and let you in. God, even if we're facing disappointment and discouragement and hard places, God, I ask that you would remind us that you are writing a beautiful story over our lives, that this is not the end, but you have planned so many good things to come. We can trust you. We can trust you, God. Not one of your promises have ever failed. Amen.